It's like not live when one says it. It's always like 1 second or two delayed. Okay, we are joined live this hour by Michael Warr. He is a poet, an author, the founder of organizations, a consultant to many nonprofits. He's been there and he's done that. We're really thrilled to have you this hour, Michael. So let's just start the story at the beginning. Tell us how you got involved in poetry.
Yeah, I like to tell the story that I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness, and I quit when I was about 17. But in that time frame, when I was in high school, I stole a book, right? So I was, on the one hand, being raised very religious, but I just could not help stealing this book. And it was a book called 3,000 Years of Black Poetry. And that is where I was introduced to Gwendolyn Brooks, who I went on to receive my first poetry award from her. And people like Amiri Baraka and Nikki Giovanni, and then even before Gwendolyn's time, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, all these poets that were at the end of this book, including Victor. The last poet in that book is Victor Hernandez Cruz. So the book starts, with these poems from 3,000 years ago. It moves to anonymous, and then it goes all the way up to the current time. And of course, the current time then. So it ends with Victor Hernandez Cruz. But Gwendolyn Brooks' poem, We Real Cool, that book that inspired so many youth, it did the same thing to me. I like to say that I had the arrogance to read that poem and say, I could do that. So Gwendolyn and I became good friends years later when I moved from San Francisco to Chicago. And I always used to tease her that I became a poet because of her, that it was her fault. So she was my first big influence. And I feel very, I feel honored that most of the poets who influenced me in that last chapter of that book, 3,000 Years of Black Poetry, I got to know, as I grew up and became an adult, and as the director of the Guild Complex in Chicago, I even got to feature them. I got to publish some of them, so it all started with that book.
That's an incredible story. I mean, it's one of those things when you get a chance to meet your heroes. Sometimes they can disappoint you though, but other times, but sometimes when it goes well, that's the most beautiful thing of all.
Well, one other thing I want to add to that, because even though it was sparked by Gwendolyn, I also happened to be growing up at a time in San Francisco where like the last poets were on the radio and Gil Scott-Heron was being played, and so those were also two of my early influences as a teenager. And even in elementary school, I had a teacher to allow us to go to different classrooms and recite poetry. I called it my poetry gang. So yeah, that was what was happening while I was in school in San Francisco.
These videos hopefully will be viewed by a wide cross section of people. So not everyone is an avid poetry reader they'll be watching. So can you tell our audience a little bit about the great Gwendolyn Brooks?
Yeah, well, the first thing they need to know is that she was the first African American, first Black poet to win the Pulitzer Prize. And the thing that I like to say about Gwendolyn, first of all, she's just absolutely brilliant. One of her books is this book that people should look out for. It's published by Third World Press, which did much of her publications. This is her book called Blacks. And the thing about Gwendolyn is she kind of made the decision because she could have spent the rest of her life in the academy, basically. And she made it a point working with people like Hakeem Adabuti, to kind of connect what she was doing and to bring poetry to the streets and bring poetry from the streets into publications and, kind of be a clarifying voice. So Hakeem Adabuti played a big role in that, and she had a profound influence on him and many other poets throughout her life. And I just like to say about her that she was so giving, so generous. And she, I think, had literally turned thousands of young people into writers, into poets, and had such a profound impact on them. So I always like to go back to her when I talk about where my own influences come from. and to pay tribute to her. I found myself doing that all the time. I also had a high school teacher, Adam Banks, who, when we were in our Black history class, asked us to write an essay of W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America. I mean, can you imagine that we were even reading that in junior high school? No, that was senior high school. And I asked him if I could do my book report as a poem. And he actually said yes. And I also give him props to this very day, because he empowered me to take something that was very serious and try to present it as a poem, which I did. It was a poem called Memoirs of Malediction. It was almost 3,000 words. And as part of the exercise in the class, I recited that poem to the class. And so that might be the first time I recited in front of a large group of people.
Yeah. No,
he was my track coach.
Yeah. So, in the process of reading some information, I really want to, we're going to talk about a lot of your poetry career, but your life has taken some interesting detours. Can you talk about the 23rd year of your life?
The 23rd year of my life. Well, I would say that around between, and I may not touch on what you're expecting, but between the ages of 21 and maybe 22, 23, I was a foreign correspondent in Africa.
Well, then these people need to get their information right, because they say you were 23.
Yeah, and that was a situation that has occurred often with me, in the sense that there's an opportunity to do something, to pursue something, and you just go for it. I had never traveled before. I had obviously never been to Africa before. I didn't have having training as a foreign correspondent or as a journalist. I took one course because I did not attend university or college, because as a Jehovah's Witness, they really are against you going into higher education. So it would have been a natural thing for me to do, even just as a track. I was a track star in high school, so I probably could have gotten a scholarship just for running track. But I didn't go to university. I wound up lecturing at every kind of major university in the country. But that opportunity to go to Africa and to spend my days for like 5 years as a foreign correspondent, writing for the BBC, the Manchester Guardian, Africa Confidential, and learning the trait of journalism, but more importantly, writing every single day. And that had a profound impact on me during that kind of formative period of my life. Thanks for finding that. I forget this stuff sometimes.
I know. I'm really. I'm. It's a fascinating thing. I mean, it's like all these the write-ups I've read about you is about talks about the Guild Complex, talks about some of the books you published, it talks about MacArthur. All these things we're going to talk about, but in reading this, like there's a little.
Yeah, very seldom does that experience in Africa come up, and I have written some pieces about it. There's a poet, there's a revolutionary fighter who was very close to me from like the first day I got there. Her name was Saro. And she was this small, woman who was extremely powerful. She was like a labor organizer, and she was really kind of taking care of me in a sense, someone arriving in this very kind of, dangerous and chaotic situation. And she, I refer to her in a poem as my guardian angel, and she was actually executed. And this happened during the time I was there. So I had a real, quick learning curve about being in that kind of a situation. And I feel that there's a lot that I want to write about that I haven't yet. And that's one of the reasons you don't see too much about it. I have some poems that cover that period, but I was actually arrested by the government. I was imprisoned under Haile Selassie's palace. They tried to recruit me to become a spy for the government.
Wow.
I was being pursued by the KGB to become a spy, by the KGB, the CIA, the Libyans, the East Germans, the West Germans, they were all after me. And then the final straw was
You're the
when the Ethiopian government asked me
man.
to become a spy. You know, it was trying to go, but also I was arrested, and I kind of maneuvered my way out of that because I had been expecting to be arrested. The first night I got to Ethiopia, I was in a villa at a meeting with all these revolutionaries, basically from the underground. They all had 45s, you know, packed. They were packing 45s on their waists. And I knew that night, I said to myself, one of these days I'm going to be arrested. And so I was always looking out for it. And I was. When they started following me, I recognized it. They followed me for like 3 days and then picked me up. I think it was after I dropped my wife off, my fiance off at her mother's. We went, no, and then we got back and they arrested me in the morning when I dropped a guy's car off, a Canadian who I was going to be using his car after he left the country for a while. But anyway, I got out of that situation, but because of, I had an Ethiopian fiance, and we got married right after that. And then that's when I left. But I've only told that story verbally. I've never really written anything about it. And it's like a spy novel, so I have to write that down someday.
You should. Okay, so this is gonna be again viewed by a wide cross section of people, and as you know, I interviewed Luis, and when I asked him about his time in Nicaragua, and the conflict between the Sandinistas and the Contras is probably a lot more well known in the United States, anyhow, as to what was going on what was happening in Ethiopia with Haile Selassie fighting, the revolutionary forces there. So can you tell us a little bit, give us a little bit of background for the Ethiopian Revolution?
I'm just going to give a little. So that revolution took place in, I think it was 1917, either 71 or 73, but that was a feudal country. The constitution of Ethiopia referred to Haile Selassie as a god. And it's a country that was broken up into, the Amharas were the ruling group, and also there were the Eritreans in the northern part of the country that had been colonized by the Italians, and there were wars going on for years. Also, there was a war in the south called Somalia. And so these things have been going on for many, many years. But there was an uprising against the Ethiopian government when Haile Selassie was in power, and there were a number of different revolutionary groups that were engaged in that. And I think that may have been like 74 when that happened. But then it was taken over, and there was a military junta called the Derg that had revolutionary currents and members in it, and there were struggles for years between these different factions. So by the time I got there, there were still struggles going on between these different factions in the government and even within the military itself. And so there was a curfew, and I was in touch with some of these people in the underground. One of them used to sneak out after curfew and come to my apartment, and I would interview him. And it was a very intense and dangerous time. It's pretty amazing to see what's gotten to today.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's things did not maybe play out the way people would have hoped in the aftermath. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that this happened, and Haile Selassie was overthrown by revolutionary forces, and that's just really not a really well-known history in the United States of America. It's not something that we really talk about here often.
And the United States was also very much connected to the Haile Selassie government, so there was also a political, geopolitical transfer of power in the Horn of Africa. With all of a sudden, the Soviet Union was more influential there after Haile Selassie was overthrown. And it was kind of one of the personal things that happened from me being there is that when people would see me in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, they would assume that they would associate me with the Black Marines who used to be there.
Right.
At this point they had military bases on the Red Sea, but at this point they were just confined to the American embassy. So people had a fond memory of the Black Marine members, and they used to. So when they'd see me, they would associate me with the Marines, And I would always get mistaken for being an Ethiopian or being a Cuban, because the Cubans were very, very engaged, not only in Ethiopia, but in Angola, and supporting the guerrilla, the national liberation movements. And in Addis Ababa at the time, the ZANU and ZAPU from the Zimbabwe liberation movement, they were being trained in Ethiopia. So those were my homies when I was there, because we were like the same age, and I would have lunch with them, which gave me an inside access to Mugabe, who was the leader of the Zimbabwe National. That was ZANU, I think. Yeah, the Zimbabwe African National Union. Prior to him coming to power, and so I was able to get a one-on-one interview with Mugabe when I was like, I don't know, I guess I must have been 23 or 24.
So at 24 years old, you were able to get a one-on-one interview with Robert Mugabe.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. That was a trip too, and that was really because of my association with his cadre. I mean, like I'm saying, they were like my homies because we were the same age. So I would go to their villa and I would have lunch, which gave me in access to, what was going on, not only with their training in Ethiopia, but also what was going on in the movement back at home. And the first time I tried to interview, I tried to interview, maybe is the right way to say it, because when I went to the Hilton Hotel to interview Mugabe, because he already considered himself a head of state, even though he wasn't yet, he asked to see my questions in advance. So I gave him my questions, and he sent one of his cadre back to me. I was in the room outside of his room, and they said, Comrade Mugabe would prefer to concentrate on the anti-imperialist struggle. And the reason he said that is because the day before, or no, just a few hours before that interview, I'd heard a report on the BBC about a conflict between these two groups, ZANU and ZAPU, in Zimbabwe, and I wanted to talk about that, and I had all these questions about it, and he did not want to answer them. Yeah. So finally, when he was over, I asked him final question. I said, Comrade Mugabe, would you be so kind to look at these questions again and see if you could answer them? He actually found like 2 or 3 other questions he would then answer. Yeah. And he said to me, so you got your questions answered anyway. And I said something like, well, 5 out of 10 ain't bad, or something like that. So, those were in lighter times, and thinking about also what happened to Mugabe.
Right, of course. I mean, of course. I mean, this is not to like heap praise nor condemnation, but I'm just more interested in a 23-year-old, 24-year-old person getting to interview this guy Robert Mugabe, and it's like that's quite a story. So you're saying, okay, so the Cuban, let me get this right. The Mugabe and the Angolans were training with the Cubans in Ethiopia.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I don't think the Angolans were training with them in Ethiopia, but the Cubans were helping, train.
Angola, right.
They were involved at that point in Angola, but they were training the Zimbabweans, both from ZANU and ZAPU, in Ethiopia. They were.
That must have been awkward.
Yeah, I mean, they had to kind of keep them apart, right? That's why we're trying to get Mugabe to talk about it. But I never found that there were real. I didn't sense a real antagonism on that level. I mean, they never talked to me about their antagonism towards the other group as a cadre. I think that antagonism may have been more at the top, than it was, and it also, it could have been more in the press. I mean, a lot of the coverage at that time was coming out of Europe. So sometimes they like to kind of play up those differences, but at least with the cadre, I didn't find it to be that antagonism to be that strong.
Right. No, that makes sense. They're not trying to. That makes sense. They're not. They're. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it makes a lot of sense to be hesitant with you as well. So, like an American journalist, I mean, nothing against you as a person, but it makes sense. And I promise we're going to get to poetry, but it's just so. This is such a rich history. This is such a rich history.
I think one of the things that you're doing that's invaluable is it's seldom that poets get a chance to talk on that level and to tell those stories and to connect to what else is going on in the world. So I greatly appreciate it.
Okay, well, I got more. So can you tell our audience, for those who don't know, what was going on in Angola? Can you tell us a little about the Cuban involvement, Guido Carnaval, and the significance of that?
Yeah. Well, people just need to understand that those were national liberation movements that were going on in Zimbabwe, in Angola, in Mozambique, in Namibia. And those were the four main struggles that are also in, I think, in Morocco. When I first got to Addis Ababa, one of the first people I met was a member of the Polisario Front. And so there was also a liberation group, I think that was in Morocco. And but most of the attention and most of what was in the news were the struggles in Namibia, Zimbabwe, Angola, and Mozambique. And so these were movements, popular movements, fighting for liberation against European colonialism, and that they all were eventually successful in liberating themselves from those colonialist powers. And so that was a big part of what was in the news. And there were very few people who were giving them support. The United States, of course, was against those movements. And I got quite an education because I would be in Addis Ababa, and I would get news sometimes. Like one time, I went to the airport in Addis Ababa to meet because Fidel Castro was arriving at the airport. And so as a member of the journalistic corps, I was out there to meet him and to report on it. So, I was there. He spoke for hours as usual. And then when I got back home to file my report, I turned on the radio because I would listen to the BBC, I'd listen to Voice of America, and sometimes I would get like an Italian news service. And I heard that there was this massive battle at the Addis Ababa airport where people were killed, when Fidel Castro arrived. And I'm like, wait, I know I miss things sometimes, but I was there. It never happened. So again, as a young journalist, just arriving in Africa from America, I could see some of the outright lies. That wasn't even a distortion. That was just an outright lie. So I was being educated very quickly and very, very deeply, gaining kind of hands-on experience about what the truth is and what it isn't. And as a journalist, one of my things was whenever I find people who are on opposite sides of the story saying the same thing, that's one of the ways you can get to the truth sometimes, but also being there, being in the situation itself. There's nothing more valuable than that.
Yeah, that is quite a story. I'm really glad that we got to share that. I mean, again, it reminds me a lot of getting a chance to talk to Luis about his experiences in Nicaragua with those were different times. Those were times when people. I mean, it's a world war, so I mean, I guess it's out there if you want to pursue it. But that was a time when poets were really going out there doing the thing. Can you tell us a little bit about? Finally getting to poetry. Can you tell us a little bit about your first book published, We Are All the Black Boy?
Yeah, that's my first book, We're All the Black Boy. That was published by Tia Chucha Press. And let me see, I have that here. Here's the cover of that. I was very fortunate that all of my books at Tia Chucha, the cover art was done by Tony Fitzpatrick, who is an amazing artist, but also has a fascinating backstory. You know, he used to be a boxer. He's a boxer who became an artist. And in this particular case, this cover that he did, he based the cover. That's a Black Panther there in the center of the piece, and he based that on the first 8 poems I gave him of the original manuscript. So I went to him, and that was one of the great things about Tia Chucha. And Tia Chucha was, you know, one of the great things about Tia Chucha is they were really putting together these very artful collaborations of not only the poetry, but the book design, as well as the visual art that was on the covers. And also you had a lot of influence as the artist, as the poet, to what that book cover was going to be. I mean, everyone from Elizabeth Alexander to, you know, to Tony Fitzpatrick did a book with Tia Chucha, a number of poets, not Tahima Jess, who was around the guild but didn't publish with Tia Chucha. Patricia Smith is a good example, David Hernandez. You had a great deal of influence on what your cover was going to look like. So this book, for me, being my first book, really kind of goes all the way back to my childhood and teen days. It deals with me growing up as a Jehovah's Witness in some of the poems. You know, it also, a lot of the pieces in here are about Chicago. And this represents a very early stage of my development as an adult poet.
Well, can you share one?
Can I just say that also that the title, We Are All the Black Boy, the poem that comes from is a poem that is about a police killing and a police shooting. And the idea behind that poem and the title is also that, you know, I may be the Black person who's being shot. That might be the Latino person who's being shot, but actually we're all being shot, right? I mean, that it is it's an attack against all of us, and that's a theme that has kind of goes through my work to this very day.
Yeah. So can you tell us? I mean, can you actually? I want to ask you a question about your relationship with the Tia Chucha Press and its founder. But first, Can you share a
poem? I can share a poem. From this particular book. I think this is my Chicago signature poem. Right. It's not too long, so I'll read this one. This is called Brain on Ice, the L Train poem. And so it's a poem about riding the L train in Chicago. A performance piece used to do at the Green Mill quite a bit. Brain on Ice, the L Train poem. There's a seat right next to me on the Milwaukee L, obviously vacant, awaiting some loop-bound occupant. Riders from Ukrainian village or maybe Warsaw rush past me in righteous but ignorant horror, not calmed by my Givenchy tie or Bass Boy penny loafers, apparently not reassured by my literary look, unmoved by my perusal of the New York Review of Books. To them, I am Cabrini Green strapped to an attaché case, and for instilled fear of being robbed, stabbed, raped, or worse, conversed with incoherently, they dare not sit next to me. I am the color purple in a navy blue overcoat. I am Bigger Thomas on his way to work. I may be Nat Turner on urbanized revolt. I am Mandingo with a big, thick, black Toshiba laptop. I am Superfly with Oxford collar and Harvard law degree. An invisible do-rag hovers above my missing Malcolm X shades. There's a bulge in my pocket, and it just might be a blade. I am the stereotypical cause effect that masochistically strikes them blind. I am the charred rope with which they hang their consciousness during terrorized imprisonment. In Hollywood formatted blackness, it's an undefiled seat. adjacent at the door, opening at the same loop stall outside the Deco art marble plantation in which we all are outwardly enslaved. So that's from my first book.
Yeah. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about Tia Chucha Press?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that Tia Chucha Press was ahead of its time, founded by Luis Rodriguez. And we were roommates at the time, by the way. And Tia Chucha, its first book, and I think Luis spoke about this in his interview with you, was Luis's own, book. And but soon after that, he began publishing other poets, and it was immediately a diverse pool of poets. And that's a profound thing about Tia Chucha and the impact that we were having on the city of Chicago, and then I think nationally. And so the first three books that were published simultaneously were David Hernandez, Rooftop Dreams, I think it was called, and then Patricia Smith's book, the Motown. God, I'm forgetting these titles, and then my book. So it's Patricia Smith, David Hernandez, and myself, and so those were published together, and had quite a big impact for us both as poets. David Hernandez was already had a legacy in Chicago. He's one of those poets who had a profound impact on me, particularly David Hernandez and his music group Street Sounds. And so Tia Chucha went on to publish many poets who, to this very day, have become really renowned. Patricia Smith being one of them, Elizabeth Alexander being another. We published Alpha Weaver. Carlos Campion was published by Tia Chucha Press, I think. And so we could go on and on, but it had a profound impact on the literary scene. And I think that it's a combination of, Luis used to talk about poetry that matters. It's kind of combining of poetry that had a message as well as design and art that just kind of raised it to a level that I don't think it had seen much before. So, and it continues to this day doing great work.
Yeah. So this is when this book is published in 1991, right? And you were in Chicago at this point in time?
Yes.
But tell us about Chicago. Tell us about the poetry scene in Chicago in the early 90s.
Yeah, that was an amazing time because there was a real, I call it a poetry movement, actually. In the book, also published by Tia Chucha, Power Lines. This was the 10th anniversary of the Gill Complex. And I wrote an introduction in here that kind of talks about what was going on in Chicago. And again, I think it was this combination of bringing together people from different walks of life, from different outlooks, from different parts of the city. And you have to understand that Chicago at the time was often spoke about as one of the most segregated cities in the world. So for there to be this literary group, this center, the Gill Complex, with the publishing wing soon after it was founded of Tia Chucha Press, bringing together these poets from across the city when there was little of that going on at the time, kind of connecting these different communities. It was very, very profound, and it had an impact for a long time. And the Gill Complex used to do like hundreds of, about 150 events a year, and it had weekly events, and it was combining poets from all these different walks of life. So that was one of its strengths. And I would mention to you earlier that Studs Terkel wrote on the back. He gave us a plug on the back of the book where he said the Gill Complex is as natural to Chicago as its rivers and lakes. It represents the writers and performances with the vision of a city of flesh and blood, men and women, rather than a city of things. And I think that part of what that means is that it was really kind of connected to the life of the city. The Gill Complex, the bookstore, the Gill Bookstore, and Tia Chucha Press all kind of flowed out of what was happening with the Harold Washington movement. Harold Washington became the first Black mayor of Chicago. And that was a very unifying time, especially with the Black and Latino communities that came together, and they successfully, led the city and bringing its first Black mayor.
Yeah, can you tell our audience again? It's a wide cross section of people, so not everyone's heard of not everybody has the same frames of reference. So, so can you tell us a little bit about who Studs Terkel was, and why that is so significant that he would give you that quote?
Yeah, well, Studs Terkel is, like he's like a Walt Whitman of journalism. He's like one of these American heroes, and that left a legacy of really bringing in the life of working people and bringing in the voices of working people. He did this throughout most of his journalistic career, and he was a columnist for many years, and just a leading light among journalists. But what was really critical about him is that he would bring in the lives of the working class, and that he provided a place for them to tell their stories. I don't know, I don't remember where you can find it, but if you search Studs Terkel, there now is an archive of his of the interviews that he did. He did a whole, years and years of these amazing interviews, and even he did an interview with together Patricia Smith, Louise, and myself. I haven't had a chance. I'm kind of afraid to go back and listen to what I said at the time. But he did a series of interviews with just about everybody that you want to hear from. So I would encourage people to Google that and listen to Studs Terkel's interview. He was a master.
I'm definitely gonna interview that. That's amazing. So you are someone in life who has both interviewed Robert Mugabe and has been interviewed by Studs Terkel.
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, it's. I think when I was interviewed, I may have been interviewed by Studs by myself once, but the one that I remember is when it was Patricia, Louise, and myself. We were interviewed as a group because we were just being recognized for the work we were doing in the arts community in Chicago at the time, particularly the poetry community.
Yeah, still quite an accomplishment. Tell us about the MacArthur.
The MacArthur. The MacArthur Foundation.
Somebody, it says that here on the thing I'm looking at.
What does it say?
All right, let me go back. Oh man, it says you got a grant from the John D. and Catherine.
Oh, you know what that is? I think that may have been a grant for $100,000 that we received when I was the founding director at the Guild. What is the Guild Complex, which is now the Guild Literary Complex, and that grant allowed. I quit my job to become the executive, full-time executive director of the complex, and that was for the first 5 years. I did that for free. I wasn't paid, but with that grant, it allowed us to have a salary for me for 2 years at the time. So I think that's what that is referring to. I don't think that I personally won an award for MacArthur. Oh, that would be amazing to have a MacArthur fellowship. I don't think I would forget that.
I know. I was kind of like, is your life so packed with accomplishments and intrigue that you have forgotten?
I'm being serious, man. I can tell you the things that I don't even remember. It's just like you say something and it sparks some memories.
Yeah,
that would be a big one, though.
That'd be kind of a large thing to have forgotten.
But however, I did not get a MacArthur award, but I did get a $40,000 award from the Haas Foundation here in San Francisco for one of my projects. So that's the kind of closest I've come to a MacArthur Foundation.
Yeah. Oh man, that's hilarious. Oh, I'm muted. No, I'm not muted. Okay. That's hilarious. That's kind of what I'm supposed to do in the pre-show, but I don't always get.
That's all right. We landed. We found what it was referenced to.
Yeah. Otherwise,
that was an important part of my development too. When I was the executive director, of a fledgling organization. We had great people around it. Luis, David Hernandez was at the first organizing meeting. Reginald Gibbons, I mean, just an amazing group of people. Lou Rosenbaum, who was running, the Midnight Special bookstore and then moved to Chicago to run the Guild bookstore. So it was an amazing group of people, but that was all blood, sweat, and tears and influence, right? I mean, none of us were being paid. And organizations, when they can get to the point where they have a paid director who can concentrate, that can lead to great things. You got to do it whether you're getting paid or not. And that's what we did. The first 5 years I was the director, I did not get paid. But, for the next 5 years, I was being paid as executive director. And it was because of that MacArthur Foundation grant that we were able to move on and start getting support from many other sources, not just locally in Chicago, but from around the country.
A writer you've mentioned several times now is one Patricia Smith. Can you tell us, tell our audience a little bit more about Patricia Smith and how she looms large over the poetry community and who that is?
Well, again, I would really encourage those who aren't familiar with her and to kind of look up Patricia Smith, because we met when we were doing a fundraiser for Guild, and it was at a blues club called Blues Etc. in Chicago. And I was just kind of, I had come back from Africa, being a foreign correspondent, and I was just, starting to work around the Guild bookstore and, just being more engaged in the literary scene. And so we were doing this fundraiser, and I just was really pushed to the forefront of helping to organize that. And one of the things I did is the poets were coming in to read. I would be at the door kind of checking them off and checking them in. And Patricia Smith showed up at the door at Blues Etc. And she was a writer for the Sun-Times at the time. I think she was writing an advice column. And we had never met before. But being Patricia Smith, when she came to the door and I invited her in, because she didn't come there as a poet. She was there as an observer. And she was there as, a columnist for the Sun-Times. Yeah. And when she came to the door and I asked her name, she said something like, honey, I don't know what you're doing, but you sure are doing it good. So that's Patricia, right? And so she probably didn't say honey, she probably said baby. But anyway, we got together the next day. We went out to lunch, and she was working at the Sun-Times, and I was working as a technology editor at a technology journal in communications. And so we had a lot of flexibility at our jobs. At least we took advantage. We may have given ourselves that flexibility, but we had like a couple of hours lunch the next day. And then she gave me these poems before we went back to our respective jobs and asked me if I would look at them. I'm on the bus riding back to my job down Michigan Avenue, and I started reading these poems. And as soon as I got back to my office, I said, the world needs to hear these poems. The world needs to listen to these, to read these poems. And so we started our collaboration in the poetry scene. We used to hang out at the Green Mill on Sundays. We would even pick poems, to read. But Patricia, since then, she's the person who has won the most slams ever. And she's gone on to, I've always said that she will be one of those Pulitzer Prize winning poets. And, it's interesting to see that I think, like Gwendolyn, Patricia Smith is having that impact on young writers, even in high school. And she just was one of the people who really brought the kind of combination of what the slam was originally all about. And that was 50% of the votes were supposed to be for your writing, and 50% of it was to be for your performance. And she kind of in a perfect manner, melded those two parts of the slam. And to me, Patricia, like many other poets who, kind of became poets out of that slam movement, went on to become great writers. They went on to take their writing more seriously in their life because of that experience, and she's just one of the best examples of it.
So, for those not familiar, can you explain to them a little bit about the significance and history of the Green Mill?
Yeah, so the Green Mill, very, very significant. Every Sunday night at the Green Mill, and the Green Mill Club, in Chicago is an amazing jazz spot. If you ever go to Chicago, if you don't already live there, check out the Green Mill. But on Sunday nights, the Green Mill Poetry Slam would take place, and that was founded by Mark Smith. And Mark is often attributed to being the founder of the Poetry Slam. Sometimes there's some controversy over that, but I think most people would agree that he is the founder of it. But at minimum, he's the person who made it a worldwide phenomenon and popularized it. And so every Sunday night, there's an open mic and a competition, and the competition is leading up to the National Slam competition, and the audience members are to become the judges in the Poetry Slam. And so I'm pretty sure that still goes on to this very day, and the Poetry Slam has become a worldwide phenomena. And the Green Mill can really all that can be traced to the Green Mill.
Fantastic. So our story begins, or not, or near the beginning. You read these poems, and you're inspired by Gwendolyn Brooks. You later get the opportunity to meet Gwendolyn Brooks, and you were later awarded the Gwendolyn Brooks Significant Illinois Poets Award.
Yeah.
What was that like for you?
Well, it's one of my favorite awards because, first of all, you don't apply for it. So that is dope. I mean, it's, you're like totally, and Gwendolyn's caught me by surprise. I'm going to mention the second time she did that. But all of a sudden, she just comes to you and you're given this award. I was given to it simultaneously with a good friend of mine, someone who was also engaged in all this stuff I've been talking about, was a founding member of the Guild, Julie Parson Nesbitt. And we were awarded at the same time the Gwendolyn Brooks Significant Illinois Poets Award. And Gwendolyn just looks out in the world, sees what's going on that's good, and decides that she's going to give that award. The funny thing about it is she gives you a choice. You can either take a U.S. savings bond for $500, or you can take the cash. Guess which I went for? I went for the cash. Yeah. I needed that cash, at the time. But also it just meant so much to me because I consider myself a poet because of that influence that Gwendolyn had on me when I was a child. And when I had the audacity, and the arrogance to say, I can do that. And so that meant so much to me. Yeah. Also, a room full of people, like a very fancy event where there were some awards being given, and a wonderful, profound poet also out of Chicago, Lee Young Lee, was being awarded. And so he was sitting in the front row, and Gwendolyn was speaking, and she just kind of in the middle of her presentation, she addresses Lee Young Lee, and she says, and Lee Young Lee. And the funny thing is that when she was addressing him, she was actually looking at someone else. I think it was like Carlos Crupillo that she was looking at. Anyway, she said, and Lee Young Lee, I want to know why you never acknowledge, how I helped you as a poet when I was one of the first poets to give you an award. And I'm like, boy, I can't wait until I'm that age where you can just screw what anybody thinks. Say what you want to say. Ever since being in that audience and seeing Gwendolyn, outside of that, I really do honestly appreciate the fact that that was my first award for poetry. I always make it a point to thank Gwendolyn Brooks, even though she's not alive anymore. I still make it a point. You never know. I believe in getting thanks, by the way. I think that's one of the things I take from having been a former Jehovah's Witness is that I like to give props.
So can you tell us a little about Armageddon Funk?
The Armageddon of Funk. So the Armageddon of Funk. Yeah, this is a great design, but one of the things that I think if we reprint it is that the of disappears. So it says the Armageddon. Oh no, it's not. It's the that disappears, but it's the Armageddon of Funk. Again, not the cover by Tony Fitzpatrick that I was able to select. This book.
Let me just say that has two very different meanings. Armageddon Funk is like this is. Like this funk is bringing about the end of things, and then the Armageddon of funk means that like someone has destroyed the funk. Okay, so yeah.
Yeah, I may have to both lobby and do my own work to get this republished, because I don't think it's been republished. So maybe with the republishing we could make that of yellow like the funk. But the thing is that this book has many interesting stories behind it. I'm only going to, share two of them with you. One,
yeah, please do.
Yeah. One of them is that this book came out, God, I mean, like, I don't know, 20 years after my first book, and this book was all set to come out not 20 years. But like a few years after my first book, it was ready to go. And when I quit my job to run the Guild complex full time, the first thing I did was to go to a retreat right outside of Chicago. And the Ragdale, it's called the Ragdale Foundation. They have a beautiful, place in the idyllic woods of this suburb of Chicago. And so I was there to complete that book, and I got a lot of work done on it. And then when I went back to Chicago, instead of I took the train back and I got to Chicago and I got on the bus, and instead of going home like a normal person would, I decided to go to my new job. My new job was at the YMCA. On Roosevelt Street in Chicago, and I was on the bus going to a neighborhood I had not wasn't used to passing through, and my body was on the bus, but my mind was still at the retreat in Ragdale, and I said I have to finish this one last poem, and so I'm sitting on the bus. I have my new Apple computer on my lap, and I'm working on this poem. These two brothers get on the bus, they sit across from me, and I look up at them, and then they move to the back of the bus, still only about 10 feet away from me, and I'm facing sideways, and they're facing forward looking at me. And then at one point, one of them goes to the door of the bus. He shouts back to his friend, like he's saying goodbye or something. So everyone's looking back. No, everyone's looking at him at the door. And then his friend in the back jumps up, grabs my computer off my lap, jumps up with it. I get up and run after him so quickly that the guy at the door is still at the door holding it open. I should have just disabled him. But anyway, I had just bought that computer for the retreat, for my new life after leaving this job I'd had. And I was trying to get my computer back. I'm running after this guy. I used to be a track star in high school, but I had not run like that in 20 years. And so I'm actually catching the guy. I get within a few feet of him. I look up and I see we're running into something called the Henry Horner Homes. Literally, there's like a dark entrance door leading like a tunnel under this building. I'm like, I got to catch this guy now. I jump to catch him. I pull a muscle in my leg, so that's over. And then I realized that the guy who had been holding the door open was running behind me. So I'm chasing the guy with my computer. The guy who was holding the door open on the bus was chasing me. So I'm kind of fortunate that I didn't catch that guy, because my whole back would have been exposed. The police show up. The bus driver was just going to keep driving. The women on the bus made him stop. I get on the bus. The police come. They're asking me all these questions. One of the questions they asked me is, "What are you doing with the $5,000 computer?" I'm like, I mean, that's like my taxi. right? I'm a writer. That's my livelihood.
Right.
So anyway, sure, that led to me losing what I had been working on at Ragdale. I had printouts of it, but I was so kind of I didn't realize it until years later, but I couldn't even look at what I had. I was just kind of defeated for a while by that. It was a national story. People in the poetry community were talking about it. Elizabeth Alexander, kind of wrote me and said, could she what did she offer to do? I think she offered to read to input any poems I had left over or something like that. But I didn't deal with that for a while, And then when I did start dealing with it about a year later, I found that my writing had changed, and I didn't quite understand what was going on with that. But I started trying to rewrite the poems that I had left over from that manuscript, and that it didn't work, And this book, The Armageddon of Funk, actually I call it a hybrid because I was able to save maybe, I don't know, 30 or 40% of the poems in that original manuscript, and then add new poems that I had been writing, for a while. And they became this combination of some of those poems from the one that were on my computer and the ones that I had been writing since became the Armageddon of Funk, a hybrid book of my writing. So this book kind of represents where I was in some ways when my writing was starting to change, and where I was when this book was published in 2011.
Wow, that was quite a story. Unexpected. I mean, that was a very funky Armageddon in your own personal life.
Yeah.
Can you share a poem from the collection?
Yeah. Let me see. I think there's a couple of them. I think I'm going to do the shorter one. I read this a lot, and I think it's kind of representative of how I like to mix, messages, politics with life and art. And this is called Hallucinating at the Velvet Lounge, to Malachi Thompson, who was a well-known trumpet player. And this was written in Chicago. And it goes like this. When Malachi blew his horn, I dreamed of cornbread, yellow mounds with burnt edges on the velvet's culinary altar. His sharp cut riffs morphed into squares of cornbread islands, floating in streams of warm butter, clinging to the ribs of my memory, speaking in trumpet tongues of passages and uprisings, ancient pain and good times jiving, sacred beats and blues timing, drive-by crying and signifying, an opiate inside of oppression, a cratered chunk of bacon-infused sweet potato, chicken smothered, maple pecan, custard-filled, smackling, crackling, jalapeno inflamed cornbread, the crepe of the slaves now sold at Whole Foods in this jazz-drenched town built of golden bricks and smokestacks, billowing fumes of corn on the cob and catfish, my mind lost in music and metaphysics, reminiscing the Sunday manna served beside my mother's succotash. And I forgot to say that the Velvet Lounge is a renowned jazz club. It's no longer with us. Spirit is, but the club was stopped a few years ago, went out of business. But it was voted as one of the 50 top jazz clubs in the world. And
or San Francisco?
Pardon? This is in Chicago. Yeah, and that was reaction to hearing one of my fellow poets, and many of my fellow poets in Chicago, during that period I was describing earlier, had big influence on me. And so one of them was Marvin Tate. And so that poem is kind of responding to Malachi performing with Marvin Tate at the Velvet Lounge.
Yeah. So one of the people we interviewed earlier in the series was Nia McAllister.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, great.
Can you tell us a little about the Moad?
Oh, yeah. Wow. Well, first of all, I am proud and just happy to see the open mic series that Moed has started. I like to think about, you know, when my book of the of poetry and protest arrived, it came to my office at the Museum of the African Diaspora, and so that's what Moed stands for. And so I like to kind of think of the kind of connection between, you know, the, you know, kind of really bringing the poetry to the house. Not that it wasn't there before me, because before I started as the deputy director at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco, I'd actually recited my work there as a poet, and I think it was the Armageddon of Funk that was actually in the Moed bookstore. So that was all happening before I even became deputy director. But Moed is like an amazing, critical place that is focused in Black culture, and not just that of African Americans, but of the diaspora. And that's always been very important to me. That was important to me in Chicago, as I described the role of the Gill Complex. And so that kind of carries through to what the Museum of the African Diaspora does. I remember when I first got there, there was some, you know, conflict over, you know, whether or not the content, the exhibitions, whether or not that should reflect just African Americans. Well, how can you talk about the African diaspora and only reflect of what's going on in the African American community? And, you know, someone was making the argument, well, African Americans are being, you know, discriminated against. They're being, you know, killed in the streets. And I'm like, yeah, that's all true, but why should that mean that you don't represent what's happening in the rest? Why does it have to be in conflict with what's going on with Black people in the rest of the world? So Moed brings all of that together. You know, what is the creativity? What is the struggle? You know, what is kind of, you know, I think the kind of critical movements, but also the joy that's being generated and created through Black artists around the world. So it's located in Museum Row in San Francisco. Not far. It's just right across, you know, kind of almost back to back with SF MoMA, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Across from there is the intersection for the arts. The Mexican Museum is going up kitty corner to where Moed is. The Jewish Museum is right in the same block where the Mexican Museum is going up. So it's kind of an important and happening part of town. I'm really happy, as I was saying, that Moed has gone on to start a dynamic literary series, the Moed literary series that's going on, happening every week, and it's continuing on the virtual front. So that's something else that people should check out.
So can you, we're talking about the open mic, and I mentioned Nia McAllister. Can you talk a little bit about what Nia has been doing there with the open mic and how long that's been going on?
Yeah, I think I'm not absolutely certain, but I think it's been at least a year and a half, you know, maybe 2 years. But she's doing really good work, and what she's doing is she's bringing these different voices from around the Bay Area. I think it's every Wednesday night, and what I like about it, and I talk about this in the introduction to A Poetry and Protest, is that, you know, there is no one Black voice, right? There is this combination, this kind of diverse voices within Blackness, and I think that literary series does a very good job of bringing those diverse voices together, but also of bringing, you know, whenever you're combining featured readers with open mic readers. You know, that's the thing that I felt really fed me when I was in Chicago and we were building the Guild, you know, the Guild Complex. And a lot of the work of THH Press also kind of came out of those open mics and those featured readings. And so what Moed is doing today is presenting this this forum for those different voices, both on the featured side and the open mic side, and also it's associated with the bookstore, which is housed in the museum. If you're in San Francisco, if you're in the Bay Area, wherever you are, if you have not been to MOAD, when it's open again after this pandemic is over, or maybe not when it's over, but whenever it's safe because there's testing done to start opening such places, I encourage you to check it out. Check it out online in the meantime.
Yeah. In the comment section, Nia says, thank you for all that you do at the MOAD. So, Nia McAllister recognizing your leadership there as a deputy director.
Thanks, Nia.
So let us talk now about we're a little over an hour, but let's get to what you got going now. Tell us about your latest project. Tell us about your latest book.
Okay. Well, the latest is of poetry and protest from Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin, and this is a project that is very dear to my heart, but it's also very kind of relevant to what continues to happen, and that is the unjust killings of young Black boys and Black men by the police. And this affects other communities. It affects the Latino community. It affects the white community as well. But the highest rates are among Blacks, and that's what this book is focused on. This book combines over about 45 different poets from over 3 different generations on issues that are relevant to that subject. It has archival materials in the book. Like here's a fatal list of racial murders, dating back all the way back to 1964, and it kind of updates that. Each poet has a portrait in the book. So here's a portrait of Elizabeth Alexander. This is kind of hard to. Of Elizabeth Alexander. Yeah. Each page is different, but then each poet also has there you go. Each poet also has what I call a I statement. It's a statement on why they're a poet, how they became a poet, what makes them continue to be a poet, and those are like 500 words and over, or under, or 500 words or under. And then there are the poems. That this is a large coffee-sized table book. So in Elizabeth's case, for instance, her poem in the book, Narrative Ali, is a takes up 4 pages, 6 pages, because each many of the pages also have archival materials. There is an archival image of Muhammad Ali, and so this continues throughout the book. That's Amiri Baraka. This may have been Amiri's. This is Amiri has both an essay in the poem and an essay in the book, as well as a poem in the book. And I think the essay by Amiri Baraka, who was one of my early influences as a poet, it's called Protest Poetry. And I think this may have been his last essay, or one of the last essays that he wrote. That image there has a little bit of story behind it. I purposely did not put my own poetry in this book, even though these are my people. I mean, this is my poetry tribe, the people who are in this book. But that's a big tribe of people who are writing about such issues. And I realized that there's so many poets who would not be in this book because of the format, where there's an essay, a portrait, long-length poems in many cases, that in an anthology that might have been able to typically include 100 or more poets, with that format, this book is already like 300 pages, and there's only 43 poets in it. But it was very intentional, that format. And so I knew a lot of poets that would deserve to be in this book would not make it into the book. And so I wasn't going to put myself in there. But I do have an introduction in here, as well as a statement at the end of the book about the whole process. And this book is published by Norton. It's done very, very well. It sold out the first print run, and it was published in 2016 and then reprinted in 2018 or 2019. So I want to encourage people to check it out. What I want to do, speaking of new projects, is I want to create a digital format of this that's updating what's going on with these issues. That also is a portal for all kinds of art on these issues, that expands it beyond the killings of Black boys and men. Many women are also, being killed by the police. This is about unjust killings. And I frankly think that a lot of the horror that we're seeing today on many different fronts, the drive toward authoritarianism and fascism, that the kind of the consciousness of the public and the soul of the public is being prepared for accepting these things through the way Black people have been treated over centuries. I mean, people, this is accepted in our society when it's clear that it's unjust. And it's very seldom that a police officer is held accountable for these killings. And so I want to keep the noise on and focus on the activity against it, and to also provide a portal where artists of all stripes can show the art that they're creating, whether it's visual, literary, musical, to this subject. And that's something that I'm working on right now and trying to get support for.
Yeah. Well, we got the links below. We have ways to connect to your work there. I thank you so much for your time.
Mm-hmm.
Any parting words?
Can I just say that another project that I'm working on is called Two Languages, One Community. And this is a language that I work with a translator and collaborator named Chung Yu. And she's also a poet. And it started with her translating my work into Chinese. But now what we're doing is going into communities wherever Blacks and Chinese speakers either work together, live together, have some kind of connection, but no cultural connection. And telling their stories, translating that, publishing it both in printed form and digital form. And the Chinese Cultural Center, we just did a big reading with them. We're working with them now to deal with the issue of the unwarranted violence against Chinese people that's happening. And they're going to be posting a poem that I've written on their site, along with a video on this subject. And it's called To Your Assailant Who Attacks Us All, a Rant in Progress. So I want people to look out for that.
And so they shall. Thank you so much, Michael. This has been an incredible journey from Ethiopia to Chicago to Gwendolyn Brooks popping in and out to this has been quite the journey in 73 minutes. So I really appreciate this that we could spend this time together, and I'm sure
you. And keep up the great work, man. I really look forward to what comes out next.
Yeah. Well, stay tuned, because I forgot. I do actually have something coming up. So I will speak to you soon, Michael. Thank you.